On this episode of the show, I have with me Anthony Jules. He is co-founder and CEO at Robust.AI, and we're going to be talking about how he actually applies his learning at different stages of companies and how he deals with scale at different stages of companies. And we're going to see how he applies that to the AI and robotics space. And in between, we'll be talking about the lessons learned, some of those transferable lessons that he's been able to apply to different businesses and different business models and different stages. And we're going to talk about what spiral conversations are and a couple other things. Anthony, I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Amir, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right. Before we start, can you tell us all what Robust.AI does?
For sure. Robust.AI builds robots and software around robots to work primarily in manufacturing and supply chain, moving material around. And we do that by working with people. So our platform is completely collaborative. It's really the fourth generation of these types of mobile robots. We work with people to do various workflows for manufacturing and logistics for human scale material handling.
Awesome. I'm sure we could do a couple episodes just on that alone, but we'll touch on it lightly. But really want to dive in and kind of go back and talk about a little bit of your journey before we catch up to the robotics AI space. And you mentioned obviously a lot of the conversation here is going to be centered around learnings at different stages. And you mentioned obviously what a company does at 20, 80, 400, 1,000 people are all different. And you got a firsthand look at that, I guess. Maybe if you can walk us through a little bit in the Wayback Machine of your time at Sapient and tell us a little bit about that. And that'll be a starting point, I guess.
Sure, Amir. So Sapient Corporation was a company that I helped build near to 20, 30 years ago. And I started there when we were 3 people when I first started there and was there for about a decade. By the time I left, we were almost 4,000 people, actually. And that experience meant I got to be part of a leadership team growing an incredibly high growth business through the many transitions that you go through. Everything from everyone being all in one room where you could solve any problem just by sticking your head up and saying a couple sentences to someone, to operating in, I think we were in 12 offices by the time I left the firm. And the really interesting thing about that is I was lucky enough to be with a group of people who were all really focused on evolving with the business, not feeling like we knew how to do anything. So we were very open to reinventing the business and reinventing ourselves and constantly wanting the business to be the best version of itself. And that drove us to change it and adapt it over time. And the really interesting thing was through that experience, realizing that change isn't linear. It happens in step functions. There's these kind of inflection points that happen at different sizes and scales of companies and people.
I love that. And I guess, to kind of maybe dive in a little bit deeper, as you saw that firsthand, you saw that growth, you said it's not linear. When you're within that scale, it's sometimes hard to see a lot of things. And sometimes it's hard to not help that you go 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, and then maybe a couple of steps forward, and you can't even tell what direction, if it's up or down sometimes. When you are seeing the evolution at those various scales and you're in it real time, talk to us a little bit about that. Tell us, what are you seeing in that real time growth, and where are you kind of seeing the opportunities to kind of make an impact as you're scaling?
Yeah, so I think 2 of the bellwethers that jump out to me. One is how effective your communication is, or you think, I have a new idea, or I want everyone to understand something. How long does that process take? If you look at the scale when you're 20 people all in one office, that's 1 email, or maybe if you want to double down on it, it's an email and a lunchtime conversation, and then everyone gets it. When you're 80 people in 2 offices, that now becomes something that you need to think through. It's an email and a couple of conversations. And now if you get to 400 people in 5 offices, you actually have to make a communication plan around that. So one of the things that I always kind of think about is the effectiveness of communication, and do you have the right patterns for that? And closely associated with that is, how long does change take? So if you think you want to do something differently, how easy is that to accomplish? And the thing that happens is both it takes longer as you get bigger, but certain types of changes take longer or shorter depending on your org structure at the time. So, for example, there were times at Sapient when we were organized by geographically, so that the leadership of the firm looked kind of like a map. Some people would be in charge of the East Coast, some people would be in charge of the West Coast, and it would kind of break down from there. And when you're organized that way, changes that are dependent on geography obviously happen very quickly, whereas changes that are dependent on, say, the industry vertical that a project is involved in might happen more slowly, because you have one company in that industry in one region, you have another company or another 2 companies in that industry in a different region, and you have to put in place other mechanisms for them to have common beliefs, common culture, information sharing. And it's hard. Whereas you flip it, and now if you're organized by industry vertical, and someone's running, say, financial services, and someone else is running manufacturing, then those industry vertical communications happen incredibly quickly. But geographical changes might be harder to implement. So, this is just an example of kind of some of the trade-offs that happen depending on org structure, depending on how people are organized, and really where people look for leadership and communication.
I love that. And I guess you mentioned that, being ruthless with yourself about your scale and what you need to be doing. I guess it'd be great to I know you told me a little bit about that, but I definitely want to have the audience kind of hear your views and what that actually means.
Yeah, so I think I generalize that even a little bit more, which is, when you're building a business, you should be your own worst critic. You should look for what's not working in your business ahead of what your market might see or your customers might see. And specifically as it applies to scale, as you're becoming larger or you have new challenges, I think it's important to have an open dialogue kind of across teams, so that you can see the issues come up. And as I shared with you, then be ruthless about what you're seeing. Be honest about what you're seeing, and then be ruthless about what you do to cope with that. Because if you are, then you have the opportunity to fashion yourself into the right tool for the job. Whereas if you're doing it completely reactively, you don't have that opportunity. More often than not, when you're purely reactive, you can't get into the best configuration. And in fact, it turns into a little bit of an opportunity. I'll use a strategic example. There was literally a day in 1995 when the signal on the internet was really clear to many of us at Sapient. And it was me and one of the CEOs and a few people in a room. And we just said, this thing is really going to change everything. The pace of adoption's there. And what this does is it democratizes the ability to get messaging out to people in a way that has never existed before. We take it for granted now, but imagine a world with no internet. It's going to allow people to do transactions online. And as soon as we saw that and said, okay, what impact can we have at our size? That informed our strategy for the next several years of the company, but most importantly for that next 6 months, where we made moves that made us look crazy from the outside, but put us in a place to be really one of the first companies that could build systems that did transactions securely on the web. And that really led that change for our clients and many of the Fortune 500.
I like to ask you a follow up with that because I think, and that's got to be an awesome time to look back on that early in the lifespan of the internet and realize that is going to make an impact. And we hear, I guess, other stories that sometimes people saw things early. Obviously, we see that with stories of Amazon, all these stories that that have now been told. I guess on the flip side, if you were to maybe, and I know you have worked at other businesses, other startups, which we'll get into, but on the flip side of that, moving into space and being wrong obviously could shift a company's trajectory. You could be betting in the wrong direction. I hate to use the word betting, but some people might see it that way. And we have seen various cycles come through. I guess when you, as a leader, as a founder, as an entrepreneur, when you see signals and you're trying to interpret, am I really seeing the opportunity or am I rationalizing the opportunity? I guess your thoughts on that, because I don't think that's one of the easiest things. I think when we look backwards, everyone's like, oh, this is profound. But at the time, 6 months in to see it, that's a whole different level of awareness that most people don't have.
Yeah, so Amir, you've hit on, I think, one of the most important questions, probably period. I can't say that I have a crystal ball and I've always been right. I'll just tell you what I go to. And I think the signal on AI right now is a perfect example. For me, what I go to is having lots of conversations and making sure I'm having conflicting conversations. If I'm not having conflicting conversations, it means I'm not opening the net wide enough. And then it really comes down to the discipline of trying to decide what you do with that challenge. It's kind of similar to being ruthless about your scale and where you are and what you're seeing in your market and what you're hearing from your customers, and giving yourself the opportunity to adapt by seeing the signal early. That ends up, for me, being the best thing that I can do, trying to find lots of different voices and making sure I'm hearing some conflicting ones. And if the conflicting ones I can't get my head around why they're right, then I'm comfortable with what 80% of people are saying. But if some of your conflicting voices, you say to yourself, yeah, I see that. Yeah, they're not wrong. Then you have to produce a more nuanced picture maybe than what you're hearing from all the people who agree with your initial position. And I think we'll probably get into it more, but I think that's the current cycle around AI is a perfect example of that. There is absolutely an amazing transition happening right now. There's absolutely an amazing opportunity that exists right now. And simultaneously, there is also a tremendous amount of hype right now. Both of these things are true. You have to always, I guess part of it is I'm inherently comfortable with dialectics, with people, things that people often think are in conflict. I often realize, don't fall for the false dichotomy. And I'm usually most comfortable when you can see the two sides of something. That means, okay, I'm probably looking at things broadly enough if I can see the two conflicting sides of this argument.
Love that. And I definitely want to come back to it. I guess before we dive into that, I did want to ask you, your time at Sapient, you'd seen that scale, you'd seen various aspects of a company's life cycle to get to those, several thousand employee level. And as I mentioned, I know you've been a part of other startups within other emerging technologies. When you look at a business like Sapient and you look at the startups you've been a part of, what are some of those transferable skills you were able to carry over? Because I think sometimes people might look at those two environments and go, well, they're not quite the same. But I guess in this case, there definitely were some transferable skills.
Yeah, I mean, I think the skills that are most transferable, I think, are in two big categories for me. One of them is just raw engineering. You're solving engineering problems regardless of the scale of the company. That's often transferable. But probably the most transferable is people skills and problem solving skills. At the end of the day, no matter what scale, you know, anything beyond working by yourself, your ability to have large impact is proportional to your ability to get people aligned toward a common goal. And, I'm really clear that my sweet spot on that is anywhere from 50 people to a few hundred. When I'm part of a bigger organization, I don't necessarily want to run the whole thing. Just give me 200 people and let me solve a problem over here. But that's the fundamental is still, how do you align a group of people around a common goal and give them the context and information that they need, and make sure that you have the skills and the resources that you need. And like many things, that's a constant process. It's not, you design an initial state and you start there, but I think, like many things, strong performance is determined by putting a feedback loop around it, looking at how you do relative to your goals, tuning, and that means sometimes adding people, subtracting people, changing focus, changing, alignment and goals, and constantly revisiting that as you're moving toward your target.
Absolutely. And, as you mentioned, you touched on, AI and robotics and, how this applies. Obviously, you just mentioned some of the transferable skills, seeing the scale, seeing things early. You kind of mentioned that. I guess when you're looking at the tremendous opportunity ahead with AI and then obviously with robotics, I also think about a time when, when we were looking at, 100 plus years ago, when the car was invented, there was hundreds and hundreds upon car manufacturers and car makers, and not many of those survived. And when you look at a space like AI, where there's just tons of startups, robotics, everyone's rushing, there's so many gaps to fill. It feels it's not the same, because I've heard the car analogy and I'm like, yeah, but that was one use case. And, and this is industry upon industries have their own use cases, narrow, wide. When you look at the opportunity ahead, and you mentioned obviously it'll be profound, how early, and you see things early, how early are we within this cycle? Is it I don't know what analogy you want to use, but just curious how early you think we are.
Yeah, I think we're very early. I've shared this idea with a few people in the last few weeks. If I were building an AI company right now, I think the most important thing to do would be to build a team that feels like they can do anything and has essentially a team of AI generalists. Because what's state of the art today is only going to be true for 6 months at best. We're in a period of incredible growth, and that the plus of that is we haven't even seen the impact yet. The downside when you're trying to build a business, of course, is volatility in what resources you have access to. The models that you use, the techniques that you use, the partners whose APIs you can have access to, all of that stuff is just going to keep changing and changing and changing over the next few years. So you have to build a team and infrastructure that keeps that in mind. The other thing that I think is really kind of clear to me about what's happening in AI right now is we're going to have many occurrences where we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because we will make great progress on some idea, and then as it scales, or as we slightly reconfigure it, or as we get more data, performance is gonna dip, and it's gonna cause a reset. We've seen this already in many of the mega scale AI providers, where they release a model, something happens, it's not as good as the one they had last week. They get a bunch of customer complaints, and then they have to roll it back. And even when you've tested 100,000 examples of something on one of these platforms, you're still not touching 1% of what users are going to touch when you put that out into the wild.
I appreciate those thoughts because I kind of see that right now, and sometimes you're like, how will these companies deal with the pace of? Because obviously, as a startup, you're quickly evolving, you're quickly moving, but you're now in an environment where the technology is quickly evolving, quickly moving. It almost feels like, and I brought this up a couple times, a little bit off topic, but I brought the subject of what tech debt's going to mean. Tech debt has meant something very specific in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But when you're having to go through these quick iterations and staying up with models and understanding, you start wondering how much you're going to be accepting of throwaway because it might not be worth going back to adjusting. And obviously people are trying to make things modular and make sure there's some insulation. But I mean, within your space of where you work at Robust.AI, I mean, as CEO and co-founder, you are working within obviously that AI space. There's a robotics component. Mm-hmm. There's a notion of models are changing, and then also there's a hardware component that's also seeing an explosion of growth where everyone wants to go. These seem a little bit even more complicated when you kind of look at the two together versus if you're trying to bring some type of generative AI to a set of data within an industry, right? So I guess when you look at the specifics and the complexities of when you marry robotics and AI, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the good news is that the robotics and hardware introduces some stability because it forces you to make some choices that you have to live with for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or at least let's say 2 or 3. And it also forces you to be really clear on your use case, your customer, and what you're going to solve and what your roadmap is. You have the problem you solve on day 1, but you have to have in mind the problem you're going to solve on day 365 and day 1000, because you can't do, you can't flash upgrade, the atoms out in the field. You can't press a button and have your robot be something else the same way that you can do with, say, SaaS software. So because that forces you to put a stake in the ground, it adds some stability. And then the flip side of that is if you've built it with the ability to run different models, to run different workflows, to allow your software to change what that hardware does, you essentially use general purpose computing, you now have an ability to iterate at an appropriate pace with that solid hardware that's out in the field and not changing. And that's really a big part of both how we've architected things and I think table stakes for anyone building a business with a hardware component. You do need this ability to not just do over-the-air updates on software, but updating machine learning models and beyond.
Oh, that's good. Obviously, that's interesting because I think as you were speaking about the hardware component bringing stability, it made a lot of sense. It does bring some constraints that you actually have to work within. I guess maybe final question. I am kind of curious because I did you did share your thoughts on the state of AI, the opportunity. I guess we're seeing a lot of growth within robotics right now. Seems like everybody is trying to get that. I'm old enough where I grew up watching the Jetsons have a robot in the house. I am kind of curious, and I know you guys work within different spaces of robotics, but when you look at the robotics market, and I ask because self-driving cars, we still don't have that. I'm waiting. I dream is to never drive again. My wife always goes, "That's ludicrous." I'm like, "That's my dream. Just have a car show up and I'll hop in and get going." When you look at robotics and where we are today and where you think we'll be in the next half decade, I mean, will there be quantum leaps? Will we be just? I guess where will we be?
Yeah, I think there will be quantum leaps, but I'll start at a bit a further out time frame. I'll say 20 years from now. So 20 years from now, there is no doubt in my mind that robotics will be the largest industry in the world. Right now we have robot vacuum cleaners, robot floor cleaners. More and more, we're starting to realize that many of our cars are robots and are going to become more so. And if you think of what's happening, not so much as new robots coming into the world as we are roboticizing different devices, different functions, and then there will be consolidation across those. There will be no reason, if you look at what we're doing, there will be no reason for a human to push a cart 45 minutes in a giant warehouse. Like that won't make sense economically. It won't make sense in terms of time value. There's no economic basis that would sustain that being a thing 20 years out. So as you look and you realize we have essentially this bounty of AI capabilities, this continuing trend of cheaper and cheaper hardware and cheaper ability to develop hardware, those curves have crossed and now come down. It would be hard to imagine us not subsuming many of these things, not because of benevolence, but purely because of the economic drivers. It's just going to be cheaper to do many of the things that we need done in the world with robots that rather than without. And it's almost like appliances now, they have way more compute than we thought they would have, and they don't necessarily even use all of it. But the compute that we will put into devices will be useful to help them make decisions. And what these devices all represent is the ability for us as humans to make decisions at the policy level, saying what we expect to happen, what outcomes we're trying to get to. And then this network of things underneath us being tasked with all of the decomposed parts of or decomposed implications of that decision. And that's everything as simple as your fantasy, Amir, of, when I want to go somewhere, I just want to step out my door and the car pulls up and it's waiting for me and I get there. But that can start with, your calendar having that appointment at the right time that informs the service that sends the maybe it's a robotaxi or maybe it's a car share that you own with, you own a car share with 4 other people, and your car for that day shows up for your trip. And we're at a point now where not just the hardware is cheap enough, the AI is smart enough, and the business models are evolving so that all of these places where economically it is more feasible for a smart machine to do a task for us, these things will come to pass.
I love it, Anthony. I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing. I'm sure we could keep talking, and I will have crazy questions, and you'll have very amazing answers. But I gotta let you get back to actually running this business. And if somebody did want to reach out to you, learn a little bit more about anything you mentioned, maybe Robust.AI, what are good ways of connecting with you?
Certainly, the easiest way for me is just reach out to me directly, Anthony at Robust.AI, and check out what we're doing on the web at Robust.AI.
Okay, fantastic. We'll include some of those links in there, Anthony. Thanks again for joining. Thanks for taking the time.
I really appreciate it, Amir. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. One, I think Anthony walked us through a couple different areas within this episode, obviously dealing with scale and his experience with Sapient, seeing that growth and those learnings. And we transitioned to how he has applied it to AI, robotics, his views on AI and robotics, where the market's going, some of the challenges and constraints of operating within that space. It's a great episode. Please share this with others who might benefit from it. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.